So if you did click this video, you probably understood that I did sell all my Sony gear, and in this video I'm going to try to explain to my thought process and to why I sold basically everything I own that was or is made from Sony. Stay tuned. So before we get into the fun part of why I actually went out and sold all my Sony gear, the reason to why I in the first place went into Sony was that I wasn't happy with the autofocus that Panasonic was providing at the time. I did buy the S5 Mark I, the first version, and I was hoping it to actually do a good job in autofocus, and in some regards it actually did. I probably have some kind of video about that on this channel, and sometimes it did, but there were a couple of times where it did lose me. And if you're using autofocus and you're a content creator as I am, and you can't rely on the autofocus, because doing this is quite hard, talking to a camera, and if you do this and you're happy with your result and your effort, and you go home and you look at the footage and you see that everything is out of focus, then you get quite mad. So that was actually the reason to why I went with Sony in the first place, because I was so happy using Panasonic. And there was this one video from a Swedish YouTuber that doesn't do content like this about cameras, but he does other types of content. But he went out and bought a Sony a7S III together with a 20mm lens, and he was showing off his new camera, of course, as you do when you get a new camera. And I was astonished of how everything was in focus all the time, and he was actually shooting in the dark. So that was the reason to why I basically the next day put my Panasonic S5, the first version, on Craigslist here in Sweden, Blocket, and I went out and bought a new Sony a7S III. So that was the only reason to why I went with Sony in the first place. And Sony did good for a long time, until they didn't. So my first reason to why I sold both my a7S III and my Sony a7 IV, it wasn't that they were bad cameras, but it was the promise made from the company itself, from Sony, about the cameras, and that was the firmware updates. I was waiting for a firmware update for the a7S III for 3 years, and at the end of 2023 or the beginning of 2023, I said to myself, if Sony doesn't make a change here or give us a firmware update to that camera to give us all the other features that they were giving to lesser or cheaper cameras, I'm gonna sell that. And they did come out with a press release that they were gonna give us some of the features that the newer cameras were getting. But for me it was too little too late, because it said a lot about what the company was about and how they thought about firmware updates. And I believe that, and I know that there are a lot of people that say different things about this when it comes to firmware updates, but I believe that if you're still selling the cameras as Sony is doing with the a7S III, and the problem with Sony is also that they're selling so many of their old cameras as well, but I believe that if you're still selling the camera in store, then you also should provide firmware updates for that camera. And that's something that a lot of people on the internet say, that you shouldn't expect a company to make their firmware updates on the older cameras, and you're buying a camera with those specific features. But I believe that if you're still selling that camera, you should still provide firmware updates and have that camera up to date. I understand if a company, let's say Panasonic, they're not still selling their GH5. I understand that they're not making firmware updates for that camera. But a company like Sony that's still selling the a7S III, I truly believe that they should still provide firmware updates as long as they're actually selling that camera first hand, especially if they have hardware in that camera that can do the things that software would enable them to do. So another thing that also bothered me quite a lot when it came to Sony and the business decisions that they were making is the strange lineups that they're basically making. They're selling the same camera but in different shapes. So let's look at the a7S III, which was basically the first more cinematic camera. Then they made the FX3, which is basically the exact same camera with another body, and later they also made the ZV-1, which basically those three cameras are the same camera which with minor differences. Also, they're selling the FX6, which basically has the same sensor, so you're not getting a better image with that camera. You're only getting a few ports, a bigger body, XLR points, which I'm not saying that they're not important, but the difference between those cameras is so small, and it bugs me so much that the camera is basically using the same technology but charging so much more, and at the same time crippling some of their cameras, which is really bad. And basically they were doing the same thing with the FX30 and the A6700, which basically is the same camera but in different bodies. And this is something that bugged me so much, because I felt that I'm investing all this money in the system and they're basically making new cameras with the same technology and making my camera or my investment being less and less significant for every second that's going. Third reason I actually sold my Sony cameras is that I was feeling that investing in Sony equipment wasn't financially sane. With that said, if you go out and invest in an A7S III and it costs, let's say, $4,000, in Sweden it's much more expensive because of taxes, also because of the Swedish crown is been doing really badly the past 5 or 6 years. So it's quite a big investment, and also you go out and invest in other gear for that setup, as lenses, microphones, and whatever it is. It's, of course, it's an investment, and if you're going to sell that a couple of years later, you want to think financially, and hopefully you will get some of the money back. The bad thing with Sony, on the other hand, is that if you made that investment with the Sony A7S III or even the FX3, and they're bringing out cameras that are much cheaper, that basically have 95% of the features, which in one way is actually good for the consumer. But if you have bought an A7S III, why should anybody buy an A7S III in 2024 used? I mean, you have the ZV-1 or ZV-1, which basically has almost all the feature except for the rugged body, which is actually quite important for me, and also the viewfinder, which also is quite important for me. But those two reasons alone are probably a reason to pay almost double for a camera for most people. So I feel that selling an A7S III is actually quite hard to get any of the money back because of the offerings that Sony has been making with their lesser camera, the ZV-1. So actually buying an FX3 or an A7S III is such a bad decision, because selling those cameras is going to be quite hard and to get a good value from them. Because if I'm going to be honest, if I was buying a Sony today, I wouldn't look at those cameras because they're so much more expensive. I would probably go with the ZV-1. I'm not sure which one is the full frame one, but I would go with that camera, because basically it's the same camera as the Sony A7S III and the FX3, except for some small things. But and I think a lot of people think in that way as well. So another thing that I'm not really happy about when it comes to Sony is what they're doing when they're protecting their bigger cameras, the FX3, the FX6, the FX9, also their Burano, is that they're crippling a lot of the other gear. I mean, we already know that like the Sony A7S III, the ZV-1 has the same sensor as the FX3 and the FX6, and I feel that they're doing everything they can to segment them by using software, and that's such a cheap trick, and I'm not a fan of it. And I feel that if I'm going to invest all my money into a system, I want the company that makes that gear are dedicated to make the best gear that they're available. And this is something that Canon also did in the 5D revolution. They were crippling some of their cameras to protect other cameras, and this is something that I dislike fully. And I believe that if you're a company or a camera maker and you're crippling your cameras on purpose, as Sony has done, as Canon has been doing, then there's something wrong with the culture of that company, and I'm not a big fan of that. So another thing that also had me thinking was that Sony in some way think that they live in a vacuum where other brands don't exist. Now I'm mostly comparing them to both Panasonic but also DJI and Apple. These are three quite large companies, where Apple is the largest, DJI is bigger than Panasonic, but all these three companies are doing so much with firmware updates, where they're actually providing us users with new features all the time. Let's look at Panasonic with their latest firmware for the S5 and the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark II X, where they're through software making the camera so much better. This is something that Sony aren't doing. Same thing with DJI. DJI is giving us so many features and firmware updates on all their products, the Action 4, the DJI Pocket 3, all their drones. So this is something that we've come to expect from a lot of companies. So do not buy the sentiment that you should only think about the features that you're getting when you're buying the camera. I actually do expect companies to try and make their products better by the time that's going through software. So those were the reasons to why I went out and sold all my Sony gear. It wasn't per se the problem with the actual cameras, because I feel that the cameras were actually quite good and they were making great images, but I did lose the trust in the company and their intentions to us consumers. I was truly feeling that the company was only looking for itself, which I understand that they should do, but they also have to think about what's best for their community and also for their customers. And this is something that was basically the reason to why I left Canon many years ago. I felt that Canon was crippling their cameras by default to save a lot of their other cameras, and I feel that Sony is doing the exact same thing. So I lost my trust the second time going now in a camera company, and hopefully it won't happen again, because I feel that the cameras that I'm gonna, or the companies that I will invest in the future, probably won't do the same mistake, but you never know, of course. But that's basically the reason why I sold all my Sony gear. I did lose my faith in Sony and their hope of the future and how they think about their customers, and that's the main reason, because they do make great cameras, and as long as they didn't have a competitor when it came to autofocus, I had basically to put up with their firmware updates not coming at all. But now that I feel that Panasonic has brought their autofocus to a level where it is competing with Sony, I'm not saying that it is as good, but it's trustworthy enough to make it a viable product to shoot yourself like I'm doing right now. And me lacking all faith in Sony to do better when it comes to firmware updates, and also to not protecting their other cameras, and also not really taking away the value of the cameras that I've had invested in, that made me in the end go and sell all my Sony gear. So guys, I would love to know what you think about this video and my reasons to why I sold all my Sony gear. And I also would love to know your thoughts about it, because I know that a lot of people don't think the same way as I'm doing, but I know that a lot of people are tired of Sony crippling some of their cameras, not giving firmware to other cameras, etc. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.